It's the last week of October, Eric. Do you know why jack-o'-lanterns can't have children?
No, why?
Because they have Halloweenies. It's the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Thanks for joining us on the 67th episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name's Eric, and I'm here with Cornball broadcast partner Tom. Paperback Warrior is a vintage fiction discussion show focusing on genre fiction of the 20th century. The show is an outgrowth of our impossibly popular blog, where you can read daily reviews at paperbackwarrior.com. There's also a spot on the blog's desktop version homepage if you want to donate using PayPal to keep the podcast ad-free. At this point, let me throw it over to Tom to tell you about today's episode.
Thank you, Eric. 2 weeks ago, we did an episode on horror fiction of the 1970s and 1980s. Well, today I want to go back a bit and tell you about a genuinely mysterious author named Allison V. Harding, who wrote horror fiction during the years 1943 to 1950 for a pulp fiction magazine called Weird Tales. Now, even if you aren't into female authors, horror, or pulp fiction, you may want to give this a listen because this lady's story is a real mystery. I'm also going to be reviewing a book called The Fog, which I thought was an action horror novel by a British author named James Herbert, and I actually have no idea what your review is today. What is it?
Hey, I'm going to be reviewing Satan Takes the Helm by Clement. It's a 1954 nautical adventure that just hit store shelves by Black Gat Books. The fine folks at Starkhouse Press are putting that out. So it actually came out on Friday, so I'm looking forward to talking about it today.
Oh, good. I'm dying to hear what you have to say about that. But before we get into all that, I want to take you back to Ocala, Florida for a recent book buying trip.
You didn't go back to that House of Horrors from last week, did you?
No, I am absolutely done doing business with Ray the book trader down there. Those of you who want to hear that story can go back to last week's episode and prepare to be frustrated and disgusted. Today I want to talk about another place I went to in Ocala to find used paperbacks. There's a place that's a very clean and well-organized used bookstore. It's in a strip mall in Ocala. It's called A Novel Idea. I try to go there whenever I'm in Ocala, even though their selection of old genre paperbacks never seems to really change. I think I might have bought all their old mysteries, and the only ones remaining being those nice Signet Ed McBain volumes with those great covers. You know the ones, right, Eric?
Yes.
All right. All of which I already own at this point. The men's adventure section there has a really generous selection of Executioner and Stony Man novels and a smattering of other titles. They also have a bunch of Rogue Angel series installments. You ever read one of those?
I've never read one.
They look kind of good to me. I've heard good. I think Paul Bishop says really nice things about them. They have Stony Man books and a bunch of other titles there. They have Deathlands and Outlanders. The Western section also has a fair amount of adult Westerns mixed in with, the usual suspects there. Now, the science fiction section there has a bunch of those Perry Rodin series paperbacks. You ever seen those?
I've seen those around, but I don't know anything about those.
Do you own any?
I don't own any.
I got a few if you ever want to borrow one. The ones at the shop in Ocala, they were crazy expensive, and I've never read one either, but I got a couple, like I said. It's actually a German series, with only a fraction of the books ever translated into English. Now, the series started in 1961, and they were first published as digest-size novels. You and I have seen books published in that size before, right? You have any of those, the digest-size books?
I do, and you know what I do with them?
What was that?
I stack them in the closet and pretend like they're not part of my collection.
It's super inconvenient, right? It doesn't fit on the shelves. It's just a weird thing to own.
Yeah.
Guess how many installments of the Perry Rodin series there were?
I don't know, maybe 50 or so?
Okay, how about 3,000?
No.
Yes. Plus, there's a spin-off series called Atlan, A-T-L-A-N, with 400 paperbacks and 200 hardcovers. And this series has worldwide sales of over 2 billion copies.
Jeez, I had no idea.
It is the most successful science fiction series ever written. And unfortunately, unless you learn to speak German, Eric, you're going to stuck reading the 126 installments that were translated into English and made available by Ace Books between 1969 and 1978.
I mean, what are they about?
All right, so Perry Rodin is actually a member of the U.S. Space Force, which at the time was not a real agency, but now appears to be, I guess. Yes. He lands on the moon and finds an abandoned spaceship. Perry Rodin adopts the extraterrestrial technology, making he and his crew immune to age and disease. Now, so the series jumps around in time over thousands of years, and there's stories that incorporate time travel, and there's paranormal stuff, parallel universes, travel to other galaxies, aliens, etc. It was written by a team of authors, and they wrote the series, and they had a great deal of latitude about what they could do because the premise of the series is just so open-ended. I know there's people out there who love the series, and others say they find it rather juvenile. The stories are supposed to be rather pulpy and melodramatic. I'm not certain of this, but I think the series may still be coming out today in Germany with new installments every so often. Listeners can correct me if I'm wrong, and as we know, that happens quite often. I always like visiting that bookstore, Novel Idea, when I'm in Ocala. The proprietor is a very nice lady, and they have a great bookstore cat named Lord Byron. Now, Eric, I know you are a dog man, and I'm a cat daddy, but are you pro or against the creature known as the bookstore cat?
I really like that bookstore down in DeLand. Here's my problem with bookstore cats.
Yes, lay it on me.
They're usually in these artsy bookstores that always tend to reject those of us that love disposable fiction. So that's my issue.
Oh, so you think that bookstore cat smells like pretentiousness?
Yes, absolutely.
But again, we got the Ocala play. You've been to a Novel Idea in Ocala. I think I sent you down there one time, right?
I don't remember that one.
Strip mall. There's a movie theater in the strip mall.
I don't remember that at all.
I think I sent you there. But the two bookstore cats that I'm familiar with, one in Ocala, one in DeLand, are perfectly reasonable cats, perfectly great bookstores, right?
Yes.
So I think you need to turn the page on the idea that the
so.
bookstore cat is something negative. Anyway, the only book there I bought was called City of Widows by Lauren D. Estelman from 1994. As we discussed on the show, he's a Detroit author who wrote both mysteries and westerns, and this one, City of Widows, is a western. According to the plot synopsis, the hero is Paige Murdoch, and I think he's a series character for Estelman, and he's sent on a mission into New Mexico to catch a fugitive. Along the way, he stumbles into the City of Widows, so called because all the men in the town are routinely killed off by banditos.
Nice.
Apaches, revolutionaries, ranchers, COVID-19, whatever kills off these guys. But it's a whole town full of widows. So if that's like your bag for dating, you've hit the right place.
Right.
Anyway, the book looks good to me. And
I've got, I like that author, and I've reviewed his stuff here on the show, but I've got a lot of his westerns too, but I just don't know which ones are Paige Murdoch and which ones aren't, and I don't know where to start. So I need to do some research on that.
Yeah, oftentimes in the back of the book, they tell you a little bit about the book, so you should check that out.
Pull them out.
All right, so you ready for this feature?
Let's do it.
All right, let's play some music. All right, today I want to talk to you about a pulp author named Allison Harding. Now, she was a horror author, and since this is October, the timing is good for that. But before I get into that, I need to explain the significance of a pulp magazine called Weird Tales. And to put that into context, I think it'd be useful to walk through a back-of-the-envelope history of the pulp magazines. You with me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So up until about 1896, magazines were mostly general interest. Some printed fiction, but it was usually mixed with nonfiction articles and poetry. Now, in October 1896, a guy named Frank Munsey, Munsey, changed all that. He owned a magazine called Argosy that printed only fiction, and in December of 1896, Munsey started printing Argosy on cheap wood pulp paper, which was more profitable to produce, making it the very first pulp magazine.
Makes sense.
Right? For the first decade of the pulp magazine, the publications did not restrict themselves to any one genre. A copy of Argosy, for example, would have all sorts of different types of stories in it. Now, this changed, Eric, in 1906 when Mr. Munsey put out a pulp fiction magazine called Railroad Man's Magazine, and it was filled with short stories about railroad stuff. And it was a huge hit, and it was the very first single-genre pulp magazine. So in 1915, a pulp magazine debuted called Detective Story Magazine, and 4 years later in 1919, Western Story Magazine followed. Now, interestingly, while science fiction, horror, and fantasy stories would occasionally appear in the general fiction pulps, it took a long time before there were dedicated pulp magazines for those genres. Now, this brings us to 1923. There was a guy by the name of J.C. Henneberger who published a magazine called College Humor, and he was a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. and he wanted to create a pulp magazine to print scary stories. So he started a pulp magazine called Weird Tales, based in Chicago. Now, in the beginning, Weird Tales was paying authors a quarter or half cent per word for their scary and creepy stories. Now, at first, Weird Tales was not profitable, and they amassed about $40,000 in debt to the magazine's printer. This Henneberger guy who owned it knew he needed to shake things up, so he wrote to a young author who sold some cool stories to Weird Tales and offered him a job editing the magazine. That young author was a guy named H.P. Lovecraft. The problem was that Lovecraft had just gotten married and moved to New York with his new wife, and the idea of moving to Chicago and freezing his tail off had no appeal to Lovecraft, who turned them down. So Henneberger turns to another editor to choose the stories, and that position changed throughout the years. In addition to H.P. Lovecraft, Weird Tales was a popular market for Robert E. Howard to sell his Conan the Barbarian stories to. You see, it wasn't all just horror, but it also stretched into science fiction and fantasy and stuff like that as well. As long as the stories were dark and weird, they fit into the Weird Tales magazine. So during the 1930s, Ray Bradbury sold multiple stories to Weird Tales. Other magazines popped up to steal the market share. Amazing Stories was a very popular one that did a lot of science fiction pulp, and there was a magazine called Unknown that was also trying to compete head-to-head with Weird Tales in the creepy stories market. They even published a story by a magician and escape artist named Harry Houdini that was actually ghostwritten by H.P. Lovecraft in 1924.
I never knew that.
Yeah. So like the pulps tended to do, some of the stories in Weird Tales got fairly graphic. Another story in 1924 called The Loved Dead by C.M. Eddy Jr. referenced necrophilia.
Ooh.
So this publication from very early days was trying to push the boundaries of kind of good taste in America. The story apparently got the magazine removed from newsstands in Indiana, where they evidently really aren't into necrophilia much, evidently, I guess to Indiana's credit. Famous literary author Tennessee Williams sold his first story to Weird Tales, actually, in August 1928. Jump forward to 1935, Robert Bloch, who later went on to write Psycho, also started selling stories to Weird Tales. There was an author by the name of George Fielding Eliot, who sold a story called The Copper Bowl to Weird Tales, where a young woman is being tortured by a bad guy, and the bad guy forces a rat to eat a tunnel through her body. So there's plenty of room for like gross out stuff in the pages of this magazine. And they also, of course, because it was a pulp magazine, featured real salacious cover art featuring nude or semi-nude women in distress. It was a big selling point for the magazine. In the 1930s, the cover artists were getting $90 to $100 per painting for the cover art for Weird Tales. Now, although Weird Tales bears that name, they did not publish stories in what you and I have discussed before as the weird menace genre, where there's always like a reasonable explanation for the supernatural events taking place in the stories. The Weird Menace pulps were popular in the 1930s, but Weird Tales just kept doing their own thing, publishing scary and gross horror and fantasy stories for their loyal and rabid fans. Okay, so this magazine's a hit. Then the 1940s rolls around, and a new generation of authors started selling stories to Weird Tales, including Fritz Leiber, Manly Wade Wellman, Theodore Sturgeon, Richard Matheson, and Frederick Brown, authors that we talk about here on the show and in our blog. So the 1950s rolls around, and the pulp magazines began dying off because there's pressure now from the 25-cent paperback original novels. The authors who were making a living at a penny per word selling short stories, they all shifted over to selling novels to paperback publishers. Now, Weird Tales was able to hang on a little longer than most of the pulp magazines, but they eventually folded in September 1954. There have been attempts over the past 60 years to bring it back in one form or another, and if you go on Amazon and search for Weird Tales, you're going to find tons and tons of compilations and anthologies of stories from Weird Tales, and those compilations are generally super cheap if you want to explore the fantasy and horror that the magazine made famous. All of this, Eric, brings me back to a woman named Allison V. Harding. Now, it's probably not a name that you know or our listeners know, and it's certainly not a name that I knew until very recently. Now, I discovered Miss Harding when I was sent a 356-page paperback called Allison V. Harding, The Forgotten Queen of Horror. I'm going to hand this to you right now. You can take a look at the book here. It's a compilation of 16 terrifying tales written by Allison Harding, all originally from Weird Tales magazine. The book was lovingly put together by our friends at Armchair Fiction, and it's got some cool Weird Tales-style cover art, as well as some black and white drawings that accompanied the original stories from Weird Tales throughout the book. Now, Armchair Fiction says that Allison Harding was a pseudonym for a woman named Jean Milligan, who was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1919 and died in 2004. Between 1943 and 1951, this lady sold 33 stories, all horror stories, to Weird Tales, with her most productive period being the 1940s. Now here's a stat. Between 1943 and 1949, there were 42 issues of Weird Tales published. 31 of those 42 issues had an Allison V. Harding story in them. So it's really not crazy to call her the forgotten queen of horror, right? This lady was writing basically a story every month in the most popular horror magazine ever published at the time,
right,
for the better part of a decade. So super big shout out to Armchair Fiction for bringing 16 of her stories back in print with this new anthology. You can get a copy at Amazon or at armchairfiction.com. This is the first ever published collection of her work. Now, but Eric, I wouldn't even be bringing this up to you if there wasn't some controversy involved here.
I love it when you say the word controversy, because we don't know what we're going to get. And you can find a rockabilly musician that wrote, some kind of crime noir. It could be a freaking Catholic priest who wrote action-adventure novels.
Or a plagiarizer who wrote Casca books. We're the Woodward and Bernstein of Pulp Fiction.
We really are. Anything can really happen.
Okay, good. We'll buckle in for this one because this gets crazy. And I don't know if Armchair Fiction is going to be happy or angry at at this feature. So there's some real controversy regarding who Allison V. Harding really was. And it kind of calls Armchair Fiction's assertion that she was Jean Milligan into question. There's a blog out there called Tellers of Weird Tales, and it's dedicated to the artists and writers of Weird Tales magazine. And in 2011, they had an article called Who Was Allison V. Harding? There's definitely something weird going on here, okay? So we have this very productive author selling 33 horror stories over a 7-year period, all to the same magazine. And then she never writes or sells a story again after 1951. And then she lives until 2004 in total obscurity. Does that seem plausible to you at all, Eric?
It would make sense if she became a nun. Maybe she, maybe she joined a monastery to find Zen.
Right. So she just she decided to sit out the paperback era when she was like one of the most productive horror authors on planet Earth in that window of time.
Maybe she found religion.
The only thing we know about Jean Milligan is that she was actually an attorney in New York City during the 1940s. Now, this blogger, I can't take credit for the original investigation here. This blogger at Tales of Weird Tales figured out that she was married to a writer by the name of Charles Lamont Buchanan. And he wrote books, serious books, under the name of Lamont Buchanan. Follow along, Eric. This gets a little confusing. Now, Mr. Buchanan is the husband of Jean Milligan, who allegedly wrote these horror stories under the name of Allison V. Harding. Now, Mr. Buchanan's own writing were books about baseball and American history during the same era, 1940s and 1950s. But Mr. Buchanan also had a side hustle. He worked as an associate editor for a magazine, and that magazine, Eric, was called Weird Tales.
Dun, da, da.
Here you go. So now one of two things are happening here. Either two writers met and fell in love. The husband helped place his wife's stories in a popular horror magazine he was editing at the time. That's possible. It's also possible, maybe even probable, that Mr. Buchanan wrote these stories and sold them to Weird Tales under the pseudonym of Allison Harding, while telling his bosses that his wife, Jean Milligan, was the real author. Now, a historian who reviewed the records of Weird Tales says that the internal paperwork from the magazine's business office claims that Jean Milligan was Allison Harding. But that may have just been Mr. Buchanan's story laundering technique. So in the comments section of the blog entry, a commenter says that Jean Milligan's niece claimed that neither she nor anyone in the family had any idea that Jean Milligan was ever a writer. Now, Mr. Buchanan was an editor at Weird Tales, so it would have been weird for him to be on the masthead as a contributing author and as an editor. Meanwhile, he had a successful career as a writer with some prestige. It seems reasonable that he didn't want to sully his good name as an author by writing trashy horror stories for this salacious pulp. So it could have been a husband-wife writing team. It's possible, but the fact that she went dormant after 1951, it still feels fishy to me, Eric. I can't get past that idea that, like, writers had this giant cash grab when the paperback book started coming out, and this lady decides to disappear into obscurity. That's why I'm not buying this. So I figured out the only way to know for sure is that I have this book now with 16 of Allison V. Harding's story in this armchair fiction compilation. So I decided to read a few to see if I could tell whether they were written by a dude or a lady. I figured that's as good as a DNA test, is my good word. Wouldn't you say?
Right.
All right. So here's what happened. First thing to know, I read a bunch of these stories, is that the stories are damn good, Eric. Regardless of who Allison Harding really was, the person could write some good pulp horror. And people should buy this book and read these stories. That's my first conclusion. My second conclusion is that there is no way on God's green earth that these stories were written by Jean Milligan or any other female in 1940s America. Everything about these stories is from a man's typewriter. You could maybe convince me that there was some level of collaboration between Mr. Buchanan and his wife, but even then, he is writing the stories, and she may be serving as some kind of editor or proofreader of some kind. First story I read is called The Frightened Engineer, and it's about a turnpike construction crew that encounters a hill on an intended route of the highway, and the hill cannot be leveled with dynamite or earth-moving equipment. While it's possible that Ms. Milligan had a real interest in civil engineering, bulldozers, and front loaders, I'm calling BS. I don't believe it for a second. Also, the story had 0 female characters. There is nothing in the story from a female perspective. I like the story. If H.P. Lovecraft wrote a Twilight Zone episode, it would be a lot like this, but this was not the work of a woman from that era. The next story I read was called The Underbody, and it was a legitimately scary horror story about a kid who sees a man half buried in a hole who keeps disappearing every time the kid goes to get his dad and show him this guy half buried in a hole. It's implied that this guy is some kind of mole man who can survive inside the earth itself. And then the mole man starts stalking the boy. It's a really good, really dark horror story. Again, no female characters, no female perspective. And I just maintain, man, this was too dark and gruesome for a 1940s American woman.
It makes sense.
The last story I read was called The Damp Man, and it's basically about a creepy stalker who follows women. But even then, the protagonist is a male sports writer who gets thrust into the situation. It is a great story, very scary. Reminding me a little bit of the movie It Follows. Do you ever watch that?
Oh, yeah, I love that.
Fantastic. In fact, the story actually inspired 2 sequels where the Damp Man comes back, neither of which are compiled in the anthology. I doubt a woman could have written this, though, man. This was it was very kind of scary, final girl stuff, right? Women are being stalked. So
for that time period.
Exactly. I think Mr. Buchanan wrote these stories, and he laundered them through his wife and a pseudonym to get them published. He was the associate editor of Weird Tales, and he was in a position to do this. The question is, why do it using a female pseudonym? And I think I had the answer for that. The chief editor of Weird Tales during this period was an experienced magazine editor who came onto the job with no experience in the world of weird fiction. Her name was Dorothy McElraith. It may have appealed to Dorothy to have a female name in the table of contents, despite what was almost certainly a mostly male readership. So that's kind of the case I'm making for the idea that Mr. Buchanan was, in fact, Allison V. Harding and not Jean Milligan. You're the jury. What do you think?
I'd say you're probably right. And, I mean, let's face it, there were female authors doing horror back then. There's Zelia Bishop, and there was one, I think it was C.L. Moore. And, I mean, you can even look at H.P. Lovecraft. He did stories with his wife at the time, Sonia Green. But I think when we look at those, they were less horror, maybe like more literary stories. I think female author Charlotte Gilmore, I think she wrote as Charlotte Perkins Gilmore. I think she even did one that was like, it was suicidal, but it was more about the social awareness of mental illness and its stigma. So I think these are more literary. But I would imagine your theory is correct that Lamont probably did the writing.
Yeah, I'm just not buying the idea that a woman's going to write that much stuff and never really write from a female perspective.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with writing from a female perspective. Dudes read books from a female point of view all the time. And so the idea that a woman's going to run away from that thing is it's counterintuitive. And maybe I'm sure there's women today I think women today are just more edgy than women were,
no doubt.
80 years ago. And so I'm not buying it. But the bottom line is people should check this out. I'm interested in hearing what the listeners think. You can comment on our Facebook page, but read a couple stories in this anthology first. Again, it's called Allison V. Harding, The Forgotten Queen of Horror. It's published by Armchair Fiction, and it's definitely worth a read. So any other thing you want to bring up on this, or should we go to your review?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I'll put you on the spot for a second. When do you think that female writing started to take an edge? Would it be Agatha Christie?
Well, I mean, Agatha Christie certainly. I mean, they're more cozy mysteries, but at least someone's getting killed in them, right? And so, I have to confess that maybe I'm not the best subject matter expert for female fiction of any kind. I mean, I could probably count on two hands and one foot the number of books by famous women I've read, and that's to my detriment. This is not me bragging or being a chauvinist. I need to read more women authors, and I thought I had solved that problem with this anthology, and then it turns out I'm such a chauvinist that I've come to the conclusion that the stories are so good that a woman could not have written them.
Jeez. Moving on.
Why don't you do a review for us? And hopefully you won't be sexist when you do it.
I had mentioned earlier that I was going to be reviewing Satan Takes the Helm. What a name. It was released by Black Cat Books on Friday, which Black Cat Books is a subsidiary of Stark House Press, who just do great work. But this one was originally published by Fawcett Gold Medal back in 1954. But what I love about these new Black Cat Books and these Stark House reprints is that they are either preserving the original covers, or they're just recreating new cover art that's reminiscent of the 50s and 60s, and I really like it. In this case, the reprint cover matches the original gold medal release.
I remember when Stark House was not doing that, and I think that Greg Shepard, the owner of Stark House, just got sick and tired of hearing from people saying, because Hard Case Crime was putting out these beautiful covers, and Stark House was putting out better books, and so, but everyone's like, but the covers. Then eventually, I think he just decided to take off the gloves and start using old cover art, figuring that nobody really knows who owns the rights to this art, and good for him for doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody loves the eye candy on these things.
Absolutely.
So Satan Takes the Helm was written by Calvin Clement. Listeners, you may remember me reviewing another Clement's book earlier this year. It was called Hell Ship to Kuma. As you can probably imagine, Clements has a knack for these nautical-themed books. I really liked Hell Ship to Kuma, and I was excited to see Satan Takes the Helm as a modern reprint. And this book stars a rugged freighter captain named Martin. And when we first meet him, he's looking for work on the docks in San Francisco. And this friend provides Martin this location where he can apply for a job. He's going to go do an interview to have this sailing job. So Martin uses the tip to meet this woman named Joyce at a hotel room. And she interviews Martin, and she asks him some really unusual questions, things like his marital status and his ability to fight, things that, at least in my experience, don't necessarily come with the job interview. So it was kind of weird that she was asking these questions. So I guess like any co-ed employment interview back then, Martin finds himself attracted to Joyce, and they kiss to seal the deal. Imagine that happening today.
HR may have an issue with that.
Well, anyway, I guess it worked because Martin's hired as the chief officer on the Trader. Now, this is an Asian freighter that's currently helmed and owned by a guy named Captain Sloan. Two things that are interesting about Captain Sloan. One, he's an elderly and horribly disfigured man. Second, he's Joyce's husband. I bet you didn't see that coming, did you?
No, he's always throwing curveballs in those gold medals.
Martin whips the ship and its employers right into shape. And when it comes to enemies and fights and unwillingness from the employees, Martin's there to solve all the problems. But they're sort of rebuking his leadership, and they refuse to accept his management, but Martin kind of soldiers on. Now, the deal with Martin is that he can gain 10% of the freighter's profits with this deal. So after getting everything in working order and producing the best crew he can, Martin's looking like he has a brand new lease on life, the perfect job, and the chance to make some real money. But there's Joyce to deal with. You see, she's so seductive and sexy that Martin just can't leave her alone. His lust and desire for Joyce threatens his ability to man the ship and earn real money. In fact, the two of them get so caught up in each other that the crew begins to suspect there's an affair in the works. And if beefy old Captain Sloan, if he finds out, Martin's going to find himself swimming with a fish. This was just a really, really fun book, Tom. I love that Clement weaves together this love triangle into this nautical adventure. It was a perfect blend. It's the femme fatale formula that people like Gil Brewer or Ori Hitt would perfect, but it's on a boat instead of this neighborly, posh suburb. The author, or whoever the original person was behind the publishing of this novel, chose the perfect book title. Satan Takes the Helm is exactly that. Joyce is devilish in her desires, and the tipping point comes about halfway through the book. I'm not going to ruin it for you. I definitely recommend buying a copy of this reprint. I think you'll love it, and if you're into that type of crime noir storytelling, I think you're going to be very entertained by this story. I'm anxious to read his third nautical novel. It's called Barge Girl, and I don't own it, but I'm looking for it. Anyway, that's it.
I think the writing's on the wall. The Stark House is on this guy.
I sure hope so.
Assuming this book sells well, they'll probably publish that as well. I would have to think.
They did. Did they do Hellship to Kuma? I can't remember.
I don't remember.
I don't know how I even got that book. I may have it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's Satan Takes the Helm by Calvin Clement.
All right. Do you generally like these nautical books? Like, do you like? Is that a setting you enjoy?
Yeah, it seems like it. And this funny thing is, I don't like being on boats.
In lieu of going in an actual boat, I'll read a book about it.
Yeah, I like them a lot.
Okay, cool. I'm going to shift gears and go back into the world of horror a little bit. First, I want to give you a pop quiz. You grew up reading horror like I did. What's your experience with James Herbert?
I read one of his haunted house books that I really, really liked. I want to say it was like The Haunted or something like that. And I read the Rats one.
Okay, yeah, I read the Rats too when I was a teenager. In fact, I remember reading the Rats coming out of when I was probably 14, coming out of my bedroom and early in the morning on like a Saturday or whatever. I was up late reading the Rats, and there's an actual dead rat on the floor in my living room. I go and I wake my parents and bring them down because I was so freaked out at this dead rat in my house. And then they turned out it was just one of my sweat socks that was like on the floor, and so they got angry at me because it had rats on the mind. But I'm not talking about rats today. I'm talking about British author James Herbert and a book called The Fog he wrote. He lived from 1953 to 2013, and he was actually the director of an advertising agency before he struck it big as a horror author in England, around the same time Stephen King was doing the same thing across the Atlantic. His first book was in 1974. It was The Rats, and it began a successful 23-novel career with worldwide sales exceeding 50 million copies. I've heard great things about his book, The Fog, and so I was dying to read it. And so I decided to read it. It was his 1975 book, and it was his second novel. Listeners should know that the 1980 John Carpenter movie, The Fog, was unrelated to the James Herbert novel. I did not know that until I read it up. I have never seen the John Carpenter movie, but I just assumed it was a novelization of it.
Wait, you've never seen that movie?
No.
Oh, dude.
Is it good?
Do you have a Blu-ray player?
No, I mean, I got streaming.
You get it. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all time.
All right, I'll check it out. I like John Carpenter. I've never seen The Fog. Unrelated to this, though.
Yes.
Let's go back to our book podcast here, okay? Many of Herbert's novels were adapted into films, but The Fog only exists on the written page and your Kindle device, Eric. Now, the novel begins in this quiet English village of Wiltshire where nothing ever seems to change. Our hero is this guy named John Holman. He's a government environmental crimes investigator, kind of like an EPA investigator, but in England back then. While he's investigating the misuse of Defense Department land, he stumbles upon Wiltshire as an earthquake is striking. Now, the rumbling opens up this giant fissure in Main Street of this little town, and it starts swallowing shops and several citizens along with it. And there's an exciting disaster movie sequence where Holman is rescuing a child before she plunges to her death in the earthly abyss. It was really good, very exciting. Now, Herbert does not waste any time with drawn-out character development. Immediately following this earthquake, a thick yellow cloud of fog begins to rise from this new crack in the earth. Now, the fog appears to be sentient, and it has tendrils that reach out toward the intended victims. What happens, though, is the fog itself is not itself menacing. What happens is when it touches people or they inhale it, the people are driven insane as they're enveloped by this fog. So, like the coronavirus, the fog affects different people in different ways. Some people become axe murderers, while others just urinate all over their neighbors. There's a good bit of genital trauma for the reader's enjoyment, if not always the character's enjoyment. The varied effects of the fog are presented in several action-packed, very violent little vignettes, kind of almost like individual short stories throughout the novel. The big question is, are the effects of this gas permanent, or will the afflicted eventually return to normal? The secondary question is the fog somehow related to these experiments taking place on a nearby military base? As a horror novel, The Fog is not particularly scary, but it's an excellent action novel with plenty of violent surprises. It reminded me of like an environmental disaster story, a medical thriller, and a high-adventure rescue mission all rolled up into one novel. Other sections of the book were almost like zombie adventures, or even my favorite Able Team installment, Army of Devils, written by G.H. Frost. There were several gratuitous graphic sex scenes, if that's your thing. I tend to like those. Overall, The Fog was an outstanding page-turner. The plotting was fast-moving, it was never dull, and the dilemmas encountered by the heroes were approached really rationally. There's plenty of violence and gore to please any action-minded reader. I just really recommend this book. Again, it's called The Fog by James Herbert. And with that, I think we're about done, Eric.
This concludes another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. Join us every day at paperbackwarrior.com for more vintage fiction reviews. And we'll see you right here for another episode next week. On behalf of Tom, this is Eric saying so long.
Be cool.